Philanthropy debate, can market-oriented reform strategies advance equity and empowerment in education? So what is the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy? So for over 40 years, we've been challenging grant makers to strengthen communities. NCRP, National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, promotes philanthropy that serves the public good, is responsive to people and communities with the least wealth and opportunity, and is held accountable to the highest standards of integrity and openness in philanthropy. Philamplify is an initiative of NCRP. So what is Philamplify? Our intent with Philamplify is to give the nation's biggest grant makers actionable feedback so they can practice strategic social philanthropy more effectively. Actionable feedback, part of what's going to happen today. We also, with Philamplify, want to spur discussion and debate in the sector about the topics raised in Philamplify assessments and break through the culture of niceness that keeps us from getting honest feedback as philanthropy. Too many people are nice to us. So we need open feedback, dialogue, spur debate, so that we can get past the niceness to get to effectiveness. My own foundation, the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, was among the first foundations to be assessed by NCRP, and we found that feedback extremely useful and helpful, and we've actually taken action from it. So, why this conversation today? Why Philamplify's debate on can market-oriented reform strategies advance equity and empowerment in education? So we know there are well-documented disparities in access and achievement in K-12 education. Disparities exist by race, by ethnicity, by income, by geography, by so many factors. Many foundations are committed to alleviating these disparities and have identified solutions, various solutions. In several recent Philamplify assessments, foundation involvement in market-based strategies for education improvement has come up, most recently in the assessment of the Walton Family Foundation, which you can find on Philamplify's website. And it's one that I'm familiar with because we work closely with the Walton Family Foundation in Arkansas. They are a great partner of ours. So with this debate, we hope to explore different perspectives on whether those strategies align with actually creating empowerment and equity in education. I want to say, as a disclaimer up front, NCRP is agnostic on whether market approaches are compatible with social justice goals. We don't see them as inherently contradictory. So that is my one disclaimer. So I want to introduce our debaters who are going to start us off on this topic. And they are Brandon Johnson, who is Deputy Political Director at Chicago Teachers Union, and Robert Pondiscio, who is a Senior Fellow and Vice President for External Affairs at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And I would like to welcome them to the podium. So, gentlemen, welcome.
What's up, brother? Good to see you. Same here.
Thank you. So that's a great way to start the debate because, you know, I have rules, includes no hair pulling, no.
Well, that's as nice as I'm going to be right there. That's
okay.
it. Too old for that. It ends right there.
I just want to make sure we got some straight ground rules. But I do want to go over the ground rules for the debate, and they are each debater will first make an opening statement, and you will have 7 minutes to do so. Afterwards, I'll invite you to respond to each other for 5 minutes, and then I will pose a second question to you. And I will give you each 5 minutes to respond. And then we actually have a panel of 3 philanthropists who will join us, and you'll be invited to the stage to discuss your perspectives on what Brandon and Robert talk about. And you will have 6 minutes to speak. The debaters will then respond to the panelists' remarks, and then we will close. And I know you didn't get all that, but I swear to you, I will moderate it, and it'll be just fine. All right. So you guys ready?
Let's do it.
So here's our first question. What is your vision for education equity, and can market-based approaches help achieve that vision?
So how are we doing this? You go first.
Shall I go first?
Sure, why not?
All right. And you know, I wanted to say this before I even begin, that this man is not my opponent in this debate. The opponents are the people who are not in this room. Anybody here who is concerned about outcome for kids, we are in agreement. We may have disagreements on how to best accomplish those goals, but we are not opponents here today. But let me start. In many ways, I am not an ideal candidate to discuss the merits of market-based approaches to education, and I say this because I'm not entirely sold upon it myself. I've given many talks, I've written lots of articles and blog posts that are frankly critical of some aspects of market-based education reform, and I'll explain that. Education reform, broadly speaking, concerns itself, and forgive me, I'm from New York, I talk fast. It concerns itself with two great levers of change, structural reform and instructional reform. So structural reform, as the name implies, pertains to the ways that we govern and run schools. Think choice and charter schools, think testing and accountability, teacher quality and the like. Now, in the main, I think these are reasonably sound ideas. Broadly speaking, I'm supportive, although I don't think any of those things in isolation are enough to bring about the vast improvements in education and equity that we all seek. I'm much more interested, I will confess, in instructional reform. Structural reforms, if you like, tend to stop at the classroom door. Most reformers, I think, are oddly incurious about what actually happens inside of classrooms. Unlike most people in education reform, I'm not incurious, I'm practically obsessed with it. This is not surprising. I spent 5 years teaching at PS 277 in the South Bronx, which was the lowest performing school in the lowest performing district in New York City. I'm still an active classroom teacher. When I'm not at Fordham, I teach 1 day a week at Democracy Prep, a charter school in Harlem, New York. My experience as a classroom teacher shaped my views on education reform, its interests, its priorities. So I want to begin by telling you about the person who's had the greatest impact on my own thinking about these issues. It was not a professor, it was not a policymaker or a fellow educator, it was not my friend and mentor Edie Hirsch Jr. who founded the Core Knowledge Foundation. It was an 11-year-old girl named Tiffany Lopez. She was a 5th grader in my class during my 2nd year teaching at PS 277. If you walk into any classroom in this country, you will immediately spot someone like Tiffany Lopez. Her eyes are always on the teacher. She's paying attention. She's in uniform. She follows directions. Her homework is done. Her desk is perfectly well organized. She grew up hearing every day how important education is. She believes it. Her behavior in class shows it. She does well in school. She gets praise, and she gets good grades. She also, forgive me, gets screwed. Since she goes to a school where the majority of her classmates read and do math well below grade level, Tiffany is, as one person put it to me, my assistant principal, frankly, not your problem. The message to any new teacher when I heard this about my student could not have been more clear. Get the other kids in the game. Tiffany will be fine. Will she? I'm not so sure. To this day, I apply what I call the Tiffany test to any new education reform policy, initiative, or teaching idea that comes down the pike. I ask myself, will this make it more likely or less likely that kids like Tiffany will get what they need to reach their full academic and life potential? The answer, frankly, too rarely comes back in the affirmative. I confess that I struggle with this to this day. Most of my work in education has been driven by a belief in the idea of education as a driver of opportunity and upward mobility. At the risk of being personal, I'm the grandson of an Italian immigrant. My father was a mechanic who went into the Army and then worked as a mechanic and worked his way up to flight engineer in a 40-year career with American Airlines. Public education worked for me. It worked for my family. So naturally, I'm attracted to education and education reform. I want Tiffany to have what I had. I believe in choice and charters. Tiffany would have been better off if she could choose a school where she would have been challenged and pushed, not one where her dutiful, compliant nature was taken advantage of and where an assistant principal told her teacher, me, Tiffany is not your problem. I believe in testing and accountability, although I have a complicated relationship with it. If it were not for the sunshine and antiseptic effect of testing, we would not see clearly just how poorly we're serving low-income kids of color like Tiffany. We wouldn't be talking about them at all, in all likelihood. On the other hand, the very same impulse that leads us to focus more energy on schools serving low-income kids prompts us to say that, that Tiffany is not our problem because she clears those low bars that we put in front of her with ease, while so many of her classmates do not. I think teacher quality matters quite a lot. We have 3.7 million teachers in American classrooms. If you have 3.7 million of anyone doing anything, you're going to have a range. I'm supportive of measures to measure teacher quality. If you make your living on the public dime, you owe the public some measure of accountability. They have a right to know if you're doing your job well or not. But frankly, I'm agnostic on some of the ways that we go about measuring teacher quality. Having said that, I don't have a lot of patience, I will confess, with somebody who says, broadly speaking, just trust the teachers and send more money. I've seen no evidence that that has worked in the past, and I don't think that that would work for Tiffany today. What really would have made a difference for Tiffany is if her education was rich, deep, thoughtful, and coherent. If she learned not just to read or do math, if she had all the history, science, art, music, etc., that her affluent peers in New Canaan or Bethesda, Maryland, for example, or the elite private schools just across the East River from her school, if she got what all of those kids got. And note well that rich, deep, coherent education is not something that can be done only in a private school or a charter school or a school of choice. Public schools can and do that. Many of them, in fact, do. So my definition of advancing equity has little to do with charters, choice, testing, and accountability. It has everything to do with this so-called Tiffany test. Is this classroom, this school, this district honoring her right to get the best of what has been thought, written, said, and discovered so that she has everything that she needs to be the intellectual peer of any kid anywhere? Is this more likely to happen in a market-driven system? Probably, but not certainly. Schools of choice can and frequently do become simply a second flavor of bad. For now, I'm much more, and this is where I'll close, I'm much more comfortable making a moral argument for market-based education. I chose my daughter's school. I want Tiffany's mother to choose her school. The well-off can pay tuition to a private school or a parochial school. They can move to a neighborhood with better schools. When Tiffany was in middle school, in fact, her mother moved Tiffany to Pennsylvania to get her into a better school district. She commuted every day to her job in New York City from Pennsylvania. Tell her about equity. Tomorrow, tens of thousands of New Yorkers, mostly low-income men and women of color, will march across the Brooklyn Bridge to demand more charters and more choice. Most of them, again, will be low-income people of color who, like Tiffany's mom, don't have time, frankly, to sit in rooms like this and talk about equity and fairness. They want good schools now. Today, in fact, do their voices count? Are they not authentic community stakeholders?
Robert, I'm sorry, but we have to adhere to the time. Although, man, I was with you, though. I was.
Okay.
Brandon, same question. What is your vision for education equity, and can market-based approaches help that vision, help achieve that vision?
Thank you very much. In Chicago, we do not talk as fast, but we certainly move with precision, so I'll attempt to do that. And thank you all for coming out this afternoon. It's in my opinion that there's been no other group in the history of the world who have tried in every possible way to educate themselves. And although the right to be educated was certainly linked to the right to be recognized as a whole human, Black people in America could not afford simply to wait for our bodies to be freed in order to escape the mental captivity, if you will. And in the South in particular, Black parents, free and enslaved, risked their bodies, literally their lives, to pursue the opportunity to educate our children. In the North, Black parents had to wage these incredible struggles to secure equal access to the schools that, quite frankly, our tax dollars were building for white children. And as this fight continues here in this current atmosphere, this is certainly nothing new to Black parents in particular. And fighting for and ultimately winning our physical freedom in this country was not only an endeavor to relieve us from the physical shame of servitude, but it was just as much an enterprise to transform the consciousness of a generation yet to be born. And so public education, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, after all, in the South, was a Negro idea. And so as we look at public education and the discourse around it, the very idea that was birthed out of our pain is now being eradicated from our neighborhoods across this country. And so what does that look like? That there are those who are in the privileged space are ultimately attempting to dictate whether or not children that look like me have the ability to actually have a high-quality public school within reach that does not require them to approach public education as a customer, but as a citizen or a resident with rights. And I am deeply troubled by the notion of the market-based solution, if you will, to the obvious disenfranchisement and the obvious shortchange in which we're experiencing across this country. And one of the things that I think is important to note as it relates to this market-driven phenomenon is that it's not new. And so I think one of the ways in which we can understand this is through the Black political project and how, as Black folks, our attempt to continue to expand democracy and democratic opportunities across the globe has always been a fundamental desire of our political consciousness. And so as you look at how the open market behaves, how philanthropy behaves, it is one of the most anti-democratic structures that exists today. And so when you think about the largest foundations in this time period that are moving an education agenda that fits their ideology and their principles, it does not reflect the democratic process in which we as Black folks in particular in this country that has ultimately led for the rights for all citizens. It doesn't match our desire. And when you look at the major foundations at this point, particularly the Walton Foundation, the Broad Foundation, these are foundations who use their dollars not just simply to provide some carrots for districts that are starved, but they use their dollars ultimately to influence policy. And so what has happened over time is you have less and less people that actually have the ability to determine ultimately what our desire is, which is a publicly funded neighborhood school that I have absolute rights to. I'll say it this way. I'll end on this. That the notion of the open market and philanthropy ultimately dictating the desires in which we've had from our existence in this country, that the result of the open market has not only failed our communities across this country, it has no accountability structure to actually challenge their failures. And so what does that failure look like? In the city of Chicago, the largest school closings in the history of the world was actually funded by the Walton family. That the Walton family would rather spend $500 million to take our rights away than actually contribute to the economy and actually pay their share in taxes to ensure that these services are actually provided. If you look at Eli Broad, this foundation, which actively looks to remove the democratic process from public education by promoting what? Appointed school boards by the same people who have driven our economy in the current state that it's in, that type of approach through the Broad Foundation is what is ultimately being dictated through school boards that have no accountability across this country. My last note is this, that the open market has brought in language to the education system that, quite frankly, does not match. And so investments, incentives, deregulation, all of those concepts are counterintuitive to the nature of education, which relies upon collaboration. The market-driven approach is the antithesis to that democratic process. And if nothing else we can agree upon is that as a parent, I should have the ability to not only control and dictate the type of schooling that my children want, that if it's not working, I should have the ability to actually improve that through a democratic process that ultimately has been lost in this market-driven approach. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you. I want to ask, because what I hear from the two of you is fundamentally education is a right, and a right that all students should have. A right to a rich, deep, coherent education, to use some of Robert's words. And to use some of Brandon's words, an education that behaves in a very democratic way, one where you actually can have access to that quality education. So in what ways are your visions similar, and what ways do they differ? And I will start with Robert.
I sometimes joke that my progressive credentials were in very good order until the day I became a public school teacher in the South Bronx. Actually, I shouldn't say until the day of. It was well into my experience. And what I mean by that is what I hope to achieve when I left my work in the media and signed up for the New York City Teaching Fellows in 2002. I was committed to, again, using the Tiffany test, to ensuring that kids like that could get what I had. That vision has not changed one iota, honestly. It still very much deeply informs the work that I do and my interest in education and education policy. What I discovered, and this gets back to the issue of instructional reform versus structural reform, is, and this is where I sound like, again, a bad spokesperson for market-based reform. I became an ed reformer, so to speak, but I've throughout tried to push ed reform into an interest in instructional reform. Again, these other things, choice, charter, structural reform, are good, worthwhile, but not sufficient. So I think we need to do both. To answer a question that you did not ask, my focus on those end goals remains the same, but what has changed is I no longer view myself as a public school advocate per se. And let me very quickly say what I mean by that. The institution of public education, and Brandon's vision is exactly right. To a point, every child needs a good education. Does every child need an education in what you and I would traditionally consider a neighborhood public school? Sure, if it's a good public school. But at the end of the day, I would argue that the institution of public education concerns me less than an educated public. In other words, I believe that the public's interest is served by ensuring we have a well-educated citizenry capable of economic self-sufficiency and self-governance, getting back to the original principles of education. But I will confess that under whose roof, on whose nickel, and under whose rules concerns me less and less the more time I spend in this. So it is all well and good to say, yes, we must have democratically run public schools. We can talk about this, I suppose. I don't view charters as undemocratically run. But the outcome concerns me more than the process. In other words, I have traded progressive means for progressive ends, would be the way to say that.
And I think the outcomes is an important place to pick up from there, is because that this experiment that has been done primarily in Black communities, poor communities across this country, that the outcomes have determined that the market does not work. That one-third of the privatization of public schools either perform the same or worse. Most of them are about the same as a traditional neighborhood school. And there's a few outliners simply because of the ability to handpick and select and be particular the type of students that the private market wants to educate. And so I think where the biggest difference is not so much just in the outcomes, because the evidence speaks to that. But I also think that it's also this very dangerous notion that the open market has this responsibility to children, but not their parents. And so what the open market has ultimately led to is not only the greatest stratification that we've ever seen in public education, where schools are highly segregated, where disinvestment has literally crippled neighborhoods across this country, but you've also seen this attack on workers. And I think that's the biggest difference that I don't think we talk enough about, that my child's success has more to do with my success as a parent than any other factor. That the condition of poverty ultimately determines one's ability to actually have access to quality. And what we've seen is this tremendous attack on workers through privatization and through the market, which, by the way, Dr. King warned us of, and says that the very ideas that are represented in the open market, which is deregulation, choice, privatization, those pose a deep threat to Black political space in particular, because it undermines the workforce. And so when you have a community like the one that I live in, where 30% of the folks are unemployed, it should not be a secret that children do not have access to neighborhood schools. They do not have access, their parents do not have access to jobs. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that as we build Black political consciousness in particular, to have like democratic institutions, to have a system in which you do not have regulation, where people do not have rights to ultimately determine what that school will consist of, that undermines an entire generation of fight and push.
So I want to, in hearing that, build on that a bit more and ask Robert, what do you see as the downsides to Brandon's approach?
Well, that's a harder question to answer. I take issue with some of his specific formulations. You know, I work for a charter school in part. I don't think you'd find anybody there who feels that we are freed of the burden of regulation and accountability. If anything, all of education, you can make a case, is too burdened. Even though I have this complicated relationship with test-driven accountability, I do think that we're a long way from getting our relationship with testing right, to create the conditions that allow teachers to teach and children to learn the full range of what they ought to. I'd also take exception to the idea that market reforms are not working. Again, I don't want to be the apologist for a market-based vision of education, but I think that there is an increasing amount of very compelling data that market reforms are working. I'm thinking specifically of the Credo report that was referenced in the Philamplify report, and if I'm not mistaken, it referenced the 2013 report, less so on the 2015 report, which showed that in particular for inner city communities of color, again, not universally, surely, but a critical mass certainly are delivering very, very good results for children. So I don't know that we can continue to say that it's all about the same. You know, not every charter school is where it needs to be, but as the sector becomes increasingly sophisticated, we are seeing absolutely transformative results for increasing number of children, especially children of color, low-income kids in inner city communities. Not all, but a very, very significant number. The limit of Brandon's vision is, frankly, you know, I want to be careful about this. Local control, as much as I admire it, can be an overrated virtue. We are troubled in our education system by a lack of expertise. In other words, it has not been proven to me. You have some local school systems that are terrific and some local school systems that are not terrific. And democracy is not necessarily a proxy for quality. And so it just is what it is. You know, there are some very good local school systems, and there's some that are substandard. What I would argue, however, is the biggest threat to low-income communities of color is generation after generation of substandard education.
So, Brandon,
yeah.
I want you to talk about the downsides to Robert's approach to achieving education equity.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, I think that you know, what Robert is presenting us today is something that I think has to be investigated a little bit deeper. That, you know, some of the specific examples of where we have some of these outliners, you're always going to have that in any given structure. The real threat to public education and to what Robert is presenting is what he actually just said, that Robert is not convinced that the democratic process is something that could yield the type of results that are important for people of color. I actually find that to be quite dangerous. This does not mean that there aren't examples of which the state or the federal government, certainly there are some examples in which the state and federal government certainly needs to be challenged more. But to take the democratic process away from the folks in which Robert is talking about has suffered the most, certainly lends itself to the type of system ultimately that justified not only the subjugation of workers, but quite frankly, slavery. That our inability to be able to govern ourselves was ultimately the rationale that was used to impose these very corporate market-driven philosophies through the workforce. And again, I think we have to interrogate and look at how taking parents' rights away from our ability to actually educate our children doing that opens us up to a tremendous detriment to the future of not just our immediate space, but to those who are looking to come through the system eventually, because that's where the vast majority of our children will be educated ultimately anyway. So I think that market approach where you take away the democratic process is certainly alarming.
I want to encourage live tweeting of our event. I'm not sure, Ben, if someone can tell us what our hashtag is. Oh, I'm sorry. It's there, Philamplify debate, hashtag Philamplify debate. So if we can make sure we tweet, call our friends and family, and let them know about this wonderful discussion, that would be terrific. So my next question will be, so what can we learn from one another? And Brandon, I'll actually start with you. What can the market and the non-market camps learn from one another and potentially even work together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fair question. I think what we can learn from one another is that when the individuals who ultimately want to move education in a particular direction, which I think we probably need more time to interrogate why these handful of philanthropists want to do that. But what I think what we can ultimately learn from one another is when we collectively approach dealing with our communities in totality, that we best service those neighborhoods. And when I talked about the unemployment rate, not just in my neighborhood, but neighborhoods across this country, where you have 30, 40, 50% of folks unemployed, you have tremendous trauma that exists in these neighborhoods. There are high violence, lack of housing, lack of access to food, that there's a reason why these neighborhoods look the way they do. And the big issue is that there are folks who are attempting to drive a particular narrative in education are the same folks who are not interested in paying their taxes. These are the same folks who find ways in which they can duck and hide away from actually participating in our democracy by actually contributing to it. And that, you know, when we look at the history of philanthropy, particularly in this country, that from 1865 to 1915, black families raised about $25 million for their children to be educated, which is an enormous amount of money. In that same time period, philanthropy offered $57 million. And so what philanthropy, or the open market, if you will, has done, it's taken the responsibility away from those who have the ability to pay, and it placed the sole burden on the rest of us. And so I think that if we're talking about innovation, we can actually do something that has worked in the past, that at the height of like our ability to close the achievement gap, the rate in which we actually taxed this country was far more just and equitable. The current structure that we have right now with the market-based so-called solutions inherently provides this inequity that exists. And so we take the innovations that were promised a generation ago to actually pay and contribute into our economy so that the services that are necessary for these neighborhoods can actually thrive.
And Robert, the same question. In what ways can we non-market and market camps learn from one another and potentially work together?
Sure. Great question. In no particular order, I do think that embracing choice is a must-have. Brandon referred to you know, the profound. You may have to tell me how you said this again, but a parent's profound right to an education for their child. I would argue that there's what greater way to exercise that profound right than to choose. I chose my daughter's school. I want all children to be able to choose their school. If anything less than that strikes me as the ultimate in undemocratic. To be frank, what else can the ed reform side learn from the neighborhood school side? Well, to be blunt, I think ed reform needs to start to look more like the people it serves. That should be a non-starter. And if we're still having this conversation in 20 years, and to be blunt, if there's a white guy having this conversation with you, there is a problem. On the other side, I would hope that those who advocate for strong traditional public schools would borrow the sense of urgency that has come from education reform. The higher expectations, the focus on academic achievement. This is not to gainsay any of Brandon's arguments, and sometimes, frankly, the monomaniacal focus on academics alone can be vexing to those of us in education reform and parents, I'm sure, at large. And also, I think we could get back to a vision of charters in particular that looks more like the vision proposed by none other than Albert Shanker, which was that charters should be engines of innovation. I say all the time that ed reform needs better enemies and better critics. One of the things that I would like to see folks in my world be more mindful of is that we cannot merely focus our efforts on creating the best possible delivery of the worst possible product. Too often we end up with a second flavor of bad, as it were, when we do that. So we risk sometimes losing our way and not being the engine of innovation that we were supposed to be.
Well, thank you all so much. So for now, deep breath. You gave us a lot of great information and quite a lot to discuss. And I am sitting here so much not wanting to be moderator, but jump right on into this discussion. But instead, we have three brilliant panelists who are going to come and jump into this discussion and talk from a philanthropy point of view. So I want to invite Lori Bazaler from the Edwin Hazen Foundation, Deborah McGriff from New Schools Venture Fund, and Jennifer Esterline from the Texas Education Grantmakers to come join me and begin our discussion. So the format, good afternoon.
Hello.
See, I'm both Gwen and Oprah now. So the format for this part of the conversation is that you each will have 6 minutes to, about 6 minutes. That doesn't mean you have to take 6 minutes. But you have about 6 minutes based on what you've heard, the information that you heard from Robert and Brandon. And just to talk with us about what do you think the best role for philanthropy is in supporting opportunities to advance equity in education, opportunities to advance empowerment in education. Again, from your perspectives, what are those? But also building on what you heard from Robert and Brandon. Now, Robert and Brandon, 6 minutes is a long time to be standing there.
Okay.
So you are welcome to be seated. I'll give you a signal to bring you back up again so that you don't have to stand there the entire time.
I accept
but to ask that you do, be prepared to respond to what you hear to close us out. So I'm going to start with Jennifer. Based on what you hear and your work that you do, the excellent work that you do with philanthropy in Texas, how do you respond to market-based strategies and how it promotes or advance equity and empowerment in education?
Thank you. Is my mic's on, right? Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored that our work in Texas might help bridge some of the perspectives that we've heard by our debaters. I've been working with philanthropy for almost close to a decade to navigate this space. So these conversations and these arguments are very, very close to my heart, and they're tricky, they're complicated, and so I'm really, really pleased that I could be here to sort of comment briefly. The world in which I live and work, which is the Texas Capitol, and the people with whom I work, which is a consortium of 34 private, family, community, and corporate foundations from all across the state of Texas, and that number is growing. We have no choice but to find the best parts of both of these arguments. We're a very diverse group, and there's another reason that we don't have the luxury of sort of going in on one side or the other, and that's because we have to focus as a state on far-reaching equitable systems-wide improvement just because of the sheer fact. So you guys have heard the term, everything's bigger in Texas, right? Okay. I just want to put a little bit of perspective and context around that statement because it really is true. So we have over 1,000 school districts. We have 202 charter operators. We have 8,571 campuses. We have 5.15 million Texas public school kids. 61% of those kids are low income. 52% are Latino, and these numbers are just growing. We add 80,000 new students every year in Texas public schools. It costs about $1 billion per year for these students to be in our state. And our 5.15 million kids make up 20% of the Texas population and 10% of all public school students in the country. So as we sit here right now, 1 in 10 public school students in America is sitting in a Texas classroom. So that's what I mean by big. It's big. This is our reality, and I think Texas foundations understand that, and I think Texas foundations realize that if we don't get it right in Texas, the rest of the nation will suffer, and if we get it right, we have an incredible opportunity, period. So we are thinking differently. We're trying to think out of the box. We're trying to think sort of in a new way about how philanthropy can engage in this space. The consortium, which is the group of funders that I represent, is philanthropy's response, to answer your question, to what we think the best role is for foundations to play in this space. We were created in 2011 for a very specific reason, and that was because we experienced a $5.4 billion, with a B, cut to public education in the state of Texas. $1.4 billion of that $5.4 billion was in the form of discretionary grants at the Texas Education Agency, which meant that that was a direct cut to decades of public-private partnership between the state and Texas philanthropy. The cuts were I think a real wake-up call for foundations. To Brandon's point, and what he said really resonated with me. Philanthropists in Texas were increasingly uncomfortable with their role in the drumbeat of here are all the things wrong with Texas public schools. And I think the cuts really kind of brought a lot of that to bear. You know, certainly philanthropy will continue to invest in education reform efforts. I mean, Texas is sort of at the forefront, or at the, at the beginning. We were really sort of at the beginning of a lot of the education reform initiatives that you see across the country. We're home to some of the best charter schools in the country. KIPP and IDEA are very, very active and very, very present in the state. But there was also a concern among Texas philanthropists that we needed to be concerned with the viability of the larger system, period. And again, the cuts really brought that home in a big way. So our members represent the diversity of opinions expressed here today, for sure. We don't get to pick and choose our perspective because our membership ranges from liberal Austin high-tech entrepreneurs to big Dallas and Houston oil gazillionaires to, West Texas rural philanthropists who are much more concerned about their towns being swept off the map by depopulation and economic stagnation. So we represent the whole gamut. And our diversity is our greatest strength because it demands consensus. So we are not one perspective or the other. We try to be both. And our members are representatives from our communities. They're community foundations, so they are representing entire regions of the state, and they're very, very connected to their communities. And we think that that's sort of changing a lot of the reputation that foundations have in the role of education reform, especially at the policy and advocacy level, because we do kind of have a different face. I think philanthropists in Texas have realized that we're tired of providing bandages for seemingly intractable problems. These are big problems, and we know that we should be involved in statewide policy because that's where the action is, but a lot of foundations, particularly smaller family foundations, don't know how to engage in the space. Is my time already up? Oh my gosh. Okay, I would just say one more thing, and that's the folks that have driven this effort are really the folks that you might not expect. They're small foundations, they're family foundations, they're nimble, they're creative, and in many ways they've been fearless. So we're focused on the big systemic problems, the big systemic solutions that we know drive educational achievement for primarily low-income Latino kids.
Excellent, excellent. Deborah, I want to go to you next.
Okay.
So in what you heard and what you think is the best role for philanthropy to play in advancing equity and empowerment in education?
I am a managing partner at New Schools Venture Fund, and our mission is to transform public education with powerful ideas and passionate entrepreneurs. And because of that definition of our mission, it is very clear that we are supportive of a market-driven approach to changing education. Our central point of view, however, is quality. We are not committed to there is only one best way to educate kids. And our focus, although we focus on all kids, we are especially focused on young people who live in underserved communities. And the vast majority of the students in the ventures that we have funded are low-income Black and Hispanic students. Our funders include high net worth individuals and the foundations that some people have questions about. And recently, just a real disclaimer, yes, we have been funded by the Broad Foundation, and yes, our largest funder of our current strategy, which I'll talk about in a minute, did come from the Walton Family Foundation. As an individual, not as the managing director at New Schools, I have also served on boards that are also funded by the Walton Family Foundation that engage the Black community in advocating for their own children and ensuring parental choice. The Black Alliance for Educational Options is an example. And I also serve on the board of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, which is also supported by the Walton Family Foundation. I really connected to Robert's story about Tiffany, and when we look at our students who are low income and Black or Latino, our students in our portfolio graduated twice the rate of other low-income Black and Latino students, and they graduate from college at 4 times the rate. So for us, it's whether or not we're transforming the lives of these young people and giving them the opportunities that they need to be successful. I have a very different definition of public education. I will tell you I worked in education, traditional public education, for over 20 years. I spent 15 years as a teacher and administrator in New York City. I still talk a little fast, Robert. I also served as the Associate Superintendent of Schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Deputy in Milwaukee, and Superintendent in Detroit, Michigan. So I have been committed to traditional public education. My daughter attended public schools in New York City, but I did not say that my daughter must go to the neighborhood school. In every case, I picked a school in New York City that was the best school to educate her, and I don't think there would be anyone in New York who would tell me when she was accepted into Bronx Science, and we lived in Manhattan, that she should not get on a bus and go to Bronx Science, because that was going to enhance the likelihood that she was going to get into Bryn Mawr, which she attended and graduated, and her neighborhood high school may not have provided that opportunity for her. And as a parent, I don't think that I can expect that for my own daughter and then not be able to be an advocate of those same opportunities for other low-income Black and Latinos families, so that there isn't this homogeneous one view in the Black community about what is best for the Black community. And so while I may have a point of view, I clearly understand that Brandon has a different point of view, but parents should be able to decide which side of this issue they want to be on and what they think is the best opportunity for their children. In terms of, I want to just share with you a little about our current strategy at New Schools. We invest in entrepreneurs. We don't run organizations. We try to find the most passionate entrepreneurs who can build new organizations that can tackle the problems of providing equity and empowerment in low-income communities. And so our first focus, and yes, we did help build the charter management market, and that's what we're most known for, because a group of philanthropists did get together and say standalone charters are not going to be the most impactful, that charters need to create systems, which we call charter management organizations. I saw in one of the definitions, education management organizations, and yes, I spent 15 years working for a for-profit charter management organization, and those schools still exist, educating kids that I helped start by members of the Black community who wanted schools, and we still invest in some of those schools through New Schools Venture Fund as well. So our first area of investment at New Schools for the next 3 to 5 years is innovative schools. How do we personalize learning? How do we provide education for young kids that will prepare them for the 21st century? The second area of investment for us is how do we invest in the tools and services that those schools and teachers and principals will need to be most effective. And then the third and final area of investment is how do we develop the senior leadership and board leadership that's necessary for these innovations, and how do we ensure that the gap between the students that we serve in our ventures, which are over 85% low-income children, how do we make sure that Black and Latinos are leaders of these organizations on their senior teams, CEOs, and are members of the boards of these organizations that are making decisions?
Appreciate that. And Lori, same question before we get into individual questions. Based on what you heard from the debaters, your own knowledge and background, in what ways can philanthropy facilitate support, equity, and empowerment in education?
Sure. So I work for the Edward Hazen Foundation, which supports organizing in communities around a number of issues, predominantly youth organizing and community organizing on education justice. We take a very strong frame around structural racism and inequity. So this is an issue that a lot of our grantees work on, obviously. So it's interesting. Robert, I think we have a lot in common. I'm the granddaughter of immigrants from the Ukraine, not Italy, but, you know, you get the idea. I was running a program for out-of-school youth 16 to 24 in Mott Haven in the South Bronx, which is a part of my narrative of how I come to this. Young people who are coming to us, and they were reading at the 2nd and 3rd grade level, and it was horrifying to me. And it was a part of my sort of awakening to a system that, frankly, had served me and my parents very well, but was not serving these kids. My father went to a school just a couple of miles from where these kids were going to school. What was the difference? Clearly, there are structural problems. I, however, would posit the answer a little bit differently than Robert. And, you know, I also come at it from a moral frame. And I think about Michael Sandel's work. Michael Sandel's a philosopher out of Harvard. He wrote a book, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. And in that book, he talks about how there are undertakings for which markets work very well, and then there are undertakings for which they are wholly inadequate and, in fact, destructive. And he uses the example of slavery. And he talks about how slavery created a market of human beings and how we then shift our relationship to that good. Those are not human beings to us anymore. They are a commodity. And therefore, our thinking about them changes, the way we treat them, our dehumanization, you know, you can go on with the rest. I would posit that a similar thing happens with education when we create a market for education, and I find that really frightening. I think that we shift from a democratic frame of collective responsibility to individuating, and we atomize society. We make parents in charge of the responsibility for their child's education as opposed to us as a collective, because when we talk about government as if it's something over there, something not us, then we have totally removed ourselves as active citizenry, right? So for me, there's a big gap between what the values that I hold for all children and what I see happening in markets and competition. Now, I really don't mean to imply that everybody who pursues those kinds of reforms is nefarious and evil. I think, you know, we have two wonderful examples of people who are dedicating their lives. I think both Deborah and Robert could be doing a lot. Jennifer could be doing all kinds of things. They're smart people. They could probably earn a lot more money doing something else too, right? I'm not implicating them individually. I'm saying that there are uninterrogated consequences when we pursue reforms using a market frame. For me, choice works. I'm used to choice. I have a lot of privilege in my life, but that isn't necessarily the case for all people. And when we shift that responsibility, I think we also start to see what we are seeing now in the way that states are treating their school budgets, right? You just talked about the divestment in the state of Texas from public education. I happen to believe, quite frankly, that that is much more difficult when parents with the privilege to navigate those systems figure out a way out and no longer have to think of themselves as participating in the funding of every child's education. We have, you know, I live in New York, so I'm speaking a little fast too, sorry. We have schools in New York that can raise over $1 million for their school, right? And that's in a traditional public system. I think that's wrong. I'm not saying that the way we do it now is good or right. I think there's major problems. But that will only be exacerbated when parent schools are not even a part of the system. You know, I think that we had an affirmative commitment to equity at one point. I think Brown versus Board of Ed was an affirmative commitment in this country, right? In 1971, African-American students performed about 39 points below white students. We had the imposition of integration, and that gap by 1988 was reduced to 19 percentage points. That's an enormous gain. And I think it was because we took on a government-driven collective responsibility. Integration was critically important, but choice is resegregating our schools. So Duke University looked at schools in North Carolina. They looked at the charter school landscape there. They found that more than 2/3 of the state's charter schools are segregated, are highly segregated, as opposed to only about 1/3 of the schools, the public schools, traditional public schools in the state. They interviewed and surveyed parents. White North Carolinian parents indicated a preference for highly segregated schools. Black parents did not. The Washington Post reported a demographic analysis in San Francisco where school enrollment with school choice and a lottery system, which is very complex to navigate, was also driving an increased segregation in the schools. This, to me, is a great problem. You have education tax credits in a number of states. Southern Education Foundation has done remarkable research on those. There are schools that get publicly funded dollars in this choice landscape. They exclude LGBTQ students by not just, they off, to the side. It is in their mandate. It is in their written materials that they are excluding these children. You have schools that, the Milton Friedman Foundation, which is one of the major proponents of these voucher programs, says that the average tax credit scholarship is about $1,000. Can you find a private school for $1,000? Because I don't know that school. Therefore, the parents who can participate in those programs have to be able to make up the difference. They have to pay for the transportation. They have to have the social means to identify those schools. There's no centralized way to find them without a system to do that under. To me, this is not a market of schools that parents choose. This is a market of students that schools choose. That is the antithesis of equity to me.
So as she wraps up, I would like to ask Brandon and Robert to come back to the podiums. And from Deborah, Lori, and Jennifer, any responses, any comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump right in, and I think, not that we, shared our notes, but this very scary space that we're in right now, where a market that classified a group of people as non-human, which was the slavery market, where Frederick Douglass actually compared the slavery market to the subjugation that workers had to endure initially after slavery, was very much comparable. And I think it's an important note that, again, I want to emphasize this, as Dr. King made it very clear, that we have to be leery, we should be very concerned about this market-driven approach that uses buzzwords like choice, that are very anti-democratic, anti-union, that this would not secure our economic space, particularly as black folks in this country, and history has proven him to be right. A much more stratified system. You have segregation that is run amok. You have unemployment that has skyrocketed. The wealth gap between the wealthiest and everybody else has proliferated to almost no end. And I think that what our sister indicated earlier, I think, is why we have to reject this market-driven approach. That the ideal of choice is false. It just is. In the city of Chicago, white parents on the north side of Chicago received $21 million that they did not ask for, while black parents on the south side of Chicago had to go on a hunger strike for 34 days. Those parents made a choice for an open enrollment school. They were denied that right. That choice only becomes available when it's about privatization. And so what I think my final thought of this is that when it comes to the market-driven approach, that the market is very much biased to those who have money and who are powerful. And so the type of education that Bill Gates can buy for his children looks different than the charters that he's promoting. The public education that Bruce Rauner, the right-wing governor in Illinois, used his power and clout to get into a selective enrollment school in Chicago looks very different than the school that has his name. And so what becomes very obvious here is the greatest predictor of what one gets out of the market is what one has as an ability to actually give into the market. And so we think that the greatest predictor should be equal dignity, and there should be work for all children, not those who have the clout and the ability to actually pay for that access.
Robert, the same. What did you hear? Any response to the panel?
Sure. Let me just tick off a couple of quick things. First, for Lori, you pushed one of my hot buttons because, in addition to my interest in literacy, civic education is something that I'm quite passionate about. To your point about the limited markets and civic education, this was something I should have listed before when I was listing the limits of market-based reform. One of the things that I think my fellow folks in education reform lose sight of is that schools are civic institutions. And I don't, frankly, see a conflict between a choice-driven system of schools and those schools functioning as civic institutions. And I would argue the charter school in which I teach, Democracy Prep, is a very good example of that. We are deeply committed to civic education, deeply committed to the community that we work in, and we actively work to make our students passionate citizens and to actively show them, here are the levers and here's how you pull them, as it were. I was disturbed, frankly. I don't want to single you out, Lori, but when you said something, I don't want to quote you incorrectly, where you said, well, choice works for me, but, and then you stopped. That is a chilling thing to say, at least for me to hear. And I'm sure you didn't mean it this way, but when you start a sentence with choice works for me, but, and imply it doesn't work for other people, is that not creating a sort of intellectual second-class citizenship? When you're saying, I have the wherewithal to choose well, but maybe you do not, so I have to choose for you. Now, again, I know you didn't say that, but that seems to be the implication, and that frightens me, frankly. I have great faith in the families of the students that I serve to choose well and wisely. Deborah, I just want to pick on something you said, or not pick on or single out something that you said, which I agree with. You said that you have a different vision than Brandon, and I applaud you for saying that, because one of the things that disturbs me is I'm inherently skeptical of those who claim to speak for any group. Look, I do not speak for the children that I serve. I do not speak for their community. But I'm skeptical of those who claim that they do. So, again, I come back to choice. Those parents are voting with their feet to be there. Choice is the ultimate form of equity in that regard, because the parents can choose of their own volition to attend my school or Brandon's or somebody else's. It doesn't get any more democratic than that.
So, Lori, I will ask for you to respond first, and then Deborah, if you too would weigh in on what you heard in terms of just this strand of conversation.
Sure. I'm sorry if my articulation of my point wasn't clear. So I'll be specific. I have privilege in my life. I am a white woman. I am straight. I have a lot of things going for me. I have the financial and social capital to have had choice. And I'm not talking about education, but I mean, you know, I can make choices about where I live. I can make choices about what supermarket I shop in. I can make all kinds of choices. I am a citizen. I can choose to vote. So choice makes sense to me in the construct of my life. If I don't interrogate that and think about what's underneath that overall, I think it's problematic. So I'll give you an example in the space that we're talking about. So in New York, there was just the high school fair. So choice is in the way that the DNA of the New York City Public Schools at this point. There's 7 floors in a high school. You go, you know, you sign your kid up for all of these different schools. Parents who have the means take a class that they pay for on how to navigate them to get their kid higher on the list for the schools that they want to go to. The other place, you know, parents are paying as much as $2,000 here in D.C. for consultants to help them navigate a public school system choice. The example in San Francisco, white parents have figured out the lottery, and they are resegregating schools. Their kids are going to the better elementary schools. I'm not saying individuals are not capable of navigating. I am saying you know, Adam Smith said perfect markets require perfect mobility and perfect information. There is not perfect information. And people, there is documentation. We all make our choices based on a whole range of factors. Some of the documentation shows that, you know, if I need an after-school program, I am going to pick a school that has an after-school program, right? It might not be the best school, but I need that because I have a job and my boss isn't going to let me go pick up my kid. If I need free transportation, if I need a reduced price lunch, if I need those things, my choices become constrained.
So, Deborah, choice is false. Girl, that's some fighting words right there.
No, I think I want to respond in three ways. One, one of my positions in New York City as director of middle schools for Community School District 13 was to get poor Black children into the best high schools in New York City. And did we pay for them to take coaching classes? Yes, we did, because affluent parents paid for their kids to be coached. Did we have middle school programs that were designed to build their skills and ability to be able to get into the School of the Arts or into a School of Science? Yes, a traditional school district can help prepare low-income children and their parents for the best choices in that traditional school district. But if you don't do that, then you're not promoting equity. The second example I want to give on choice, in New York City, people always said low-income parents don't care. So when Eva Moskowitz decided that she would have a public display of parent choice, people said that was so unfair. Why would she have thousands of parents come when she only has 200 seats in her school? The reason she did it was to show people how desperate poor parents were for better options for their kids. Second, when we talk about segregated schools and charters segregating, Brown versus the Board of Education passed when I was in kindergarten. I grew up in Virginia. I went K through 12 in my segregated school. So whatever all deliberate speed was, but I felt fortunate because the other cities in my state closed schools rather than integrate them. The gap, the racial gap in achievement has closed, but the biggest gap today is the gap between the rich and the affluent, regardless of race. So if we want to talk about equity, you can't just talk about racial equity. We have to talk about socioeconomic equity. And then the last thing I will say is that we can talk about slavery, but one of the rights, and you can talk about parents having the right to improve their schools. I know schools that have been improving. I'm not going to name it because this is but I know schools that were being improved when I was teaching in the 70s. That school is still being improved, and there are parents, and what right we need to be talking about is the parents to have the right to exit. And when you lock them into a defined attendance area, they don't have the right to exit. And when integration started, what did people do in the cities? They moved to the suburbs, and by default, urban school districts became segregated.
Now, Jennifer, some would say consensus building is not education reform. That consensus building is not going to get you towards equity empowerment. What would you say in that conversation?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, certainly not here to debate the merits of market-based strategies. What I'm here to talk about is the role of philanthropy in promoting equity and the way that the consortium of now 34 foundations would define it in Texas is statewide policies that affect the largest number of students, especially those with the greatest needs. So just to give you an example, this last legislative session, we worked on, we talked about budget cuts. That was a big thing for us with school finance and talking about what funding it does for districts and how important it is to have that money, and when it's taken away, what happens. We talk about expanded and improved access to pre-kindergarten, which affects all which affects a lot of Texas school kids. And then we talk about ensuring that low-income, first-generation Latinos primarily have access to really quality multiple pathways, because Texas has undergone really sweeping changes to high school graduation requirements. So we're focused on the big statewide policy issues that affect the most kids.
And do you feel that's getting you towards education and empowerment, in that you don't take a stand in one way or the other, but that you build consensus? And I'm not against consensus.
Yeah, I think it's the only way that we are able to make progress in a state like Texas. It's a really tough state to work in. It's a very red state. It's getting redder by the day. And so if we're not working within that political reality and that context, we should all just go home and pack it up and go home. So yeah, we've made some really good strides, and we're really proud of it. Thank you.
So what should philanthropy be doing? So we spoke about what philanthropy is doing, but what should philanthropy be doing?
So I have some ideas around that, and again, the same sort of market-driven approach that dehumanized, discriminated against, excluded us, now wants to present itself to us as our savior, and the history has told us that it doesn't work that way, and I think what Deborah and Robert are attempting to articulate is something that emboldens my argument, is that the fact that we continue to talk about a selected few that make it and navigate through the system, demonstrates that the market doesn't work and that the market only has the ability to reinforce inequality, because there will be those who get it and those who don't. And so this idea of choice is false simply because as a parent, I do not have a choice to attend a charter school. They reserve the right to reject me. So now I'm a customer. What a real choice would be is they have the ability not to figure out where the best high school in the city is, but how about the best high school that actually exists in my neighborhood? Why is it so impossible for us to believe that a neighborhood could be fully employed, that a neighborhood could be fully serviced, that a neighborhood could actually have the type of education that President Obama, Bruce Rauner are prepared to pay for their children, but the rest of us have to navigate a system to find if my child will have a science lab? That type of market-driven approach is detrimental to our existence. Period. It's proven that. And so what the philanthropy of the market-driven sort of phenomenon could do is actually contribute to our economy and stop avoiding the taxation that is required to provide these services. We have one man in Illinois, Ken Griffin, that if you actually taxed him at a progressive rate, his taxes alone would eradicate the budget deficit. One person. And so what we have in Chicago is, as a parent, I have to dodge bullets. I have to go to work every day. I have to find a school that has a science lab. I got to find an after-school program. I can't drive too fast because I might get a red light ticket. The type of repression that's being imposed in our communities through this market-driven so-called choice approach is false. It's not working, and it's by design, because the market does not have the ability to promote equity. It has the ability to determine if one kid gets it, one kid might get it, I may not get it, and if I didn't get it, somehow I did something wrong. That is not just. That is not what my father dreamed of. It's not the dream that I have for my children. We have to promote that the people who have the money, as they continue to drive our markets down through these terrible schemes to these banks, these toxic swaps, the same people, Eli Broad, who works through this insurance phenomenon that crashed the market, Eli Broad is actively speaking against an elected representative school board. He does not believe that parents have the ability to actually select their own governance. That's a problem. That's the scary part.
Robert, what should philanthropy, again, you talked about what philanthropy is doing. In your humble opinion, what should philanthropy do?
Good question. I guess I can end where I started. I think the challenge for philanthropy is to take a broader view of what education reform can and should be. We are here to talk about the efficacy of market-driven reforms. I remain a supporter of them, but I remain clear-eyed that they are necessary but not sufficient. They should create the conditions that lead to true educational or instructional innovation, and I have been disappointed heretofore in the sector's ability to do that. So philanthropy, those who hold the purse get the hearing, so to speak. So philanthropists do have the ability to demand more of charters, schools of choice and charters, to really push reform, the reform mindset, that sense of urgency, that sense of equity into the classroom, and demand that low-income kids get the equal, not just in terms of resources, but in terms of content, in terms of intellectual challenge that my daughter gets, that many of the children children of parents in this room get. I think that would be a very good starting line. If I can respond just very quickly to Brandon, and I admire your passion, and may you never lose that, because it's in short supply in this country and we need it desperately. Something that you said, and I'll paraphrase again, that we should not have to approach education as a customer, but as a citizen with rights. I could not agree more with that. Brandon is very eloquent and persuasive on the idea of democratic control of schools. I'm persuaded. But democracy is one side of the American coin. There is another side, and it's liberty. Again, I chose my daughter's school. I cannot think of any sensible reason to constrain our liberty to choose the best possible education for our children. Yes, there should not be a choice between equity and excellence. Obviously, nobody would agree that there should be a choice. It's a false dichotomy. We should do both. But why in God's name does it never work out that way?
Robert, I don't think it's about liberty. I actually think it's about privilege, and I think that's what Lori was getting at. Look, I think one of the I'm way out of line, aren't I, right now?
Yeah. Work it out. You're now impinging upon the panel's time, but that's okay.
But it's a privilege. It's not a liberty, and I think that we should just keep that in mind, that we live in a supremacist society that privileges one group who can approach the market with something, and those of us who can't, we get what we can't get because we can't give into it.
Deborah, Lori, Jennifer, if any of you guys, you don't all three have to respond, but what should philanthropy do?
Well, I don't know if I'm responding to what philanthropy should do, but I do think in this conversation, it's almost been like philanthropy does not contribute to traditional public schools. They're not giving all of their money to charter schools and market-driven initiatives, and I don't know any traditional public schools district that's telling philanthropists that want to give them money, we won't take it. And I just think we need to create a more accurate picture. I mean, we can say anything to support our point of view, but tell the whole truth. Kenneth Clark also said that public education is education that's in the public's interest. No one said that public education is only education that's governed by a traditional school board. And there's research on whether an elected board or an appointed board is more effective. That's what got Eli Broad thinking about how should boards be created, because there are traditional school district boards that are appointed. So I'm just all for honesty, but in terms of how philanthropists can continue to support educating the low-income and working-class kids from low-income and working-class families that I care most about, is invest in innovative school models, whether they're in traditional school districts or whether they're in what we're now calling the market. Make sure that these new schools are really preparing kids not for the 100 years ago, but what they need in the future, and deal directly in funding equity issues that really make sure that communities are engaged, that things are not done to communities, they are done with communities, and to make sure that the people who are leading these innovations reflect the diversity of the kids and their families that are receiving the services. And they can put their money to these three things.
So I think it's great for philanthropy to fund innovation. I think we have the responsibility because we have so little accountability, frankly, right? So we can take risks and do things that fail, and we should. So I appreciate that. I also think that there is a great need to do the other piece which is about power. So Hazen does not fund schools. We don't fund school leaders. We don't fund charter schools, traditional schools, any programs. We fund communities developing a shared analysis of the conditions that they experience and collectively building power and taking action to change those conditions for themselves, their children, and their communities. I think I have been on a soapbox about this for a long time. People who know me are smiling and laughing. If we can figure out a way to truly do that, to truly provide the resources that give communities not just a seat at the children's table, but a seat at the table, a powerful seat, that has accountability, that ensures transparency from the systems, and that takes a collective approach. When I talk to parents, many of them understand the changes that they are seeking are not just about their children, they may be about children in the next generation. They understand that's insufficient, and they make a choice for their child, but their commitment is to great schools in their community for their children that their kids can walk to and not worry about, and that there are jobs that are supported, that the people who are working there feel powerful and engaged and a part of that community as well. So I would push for us all in philanthropy to think about our privilege and how we don't make choices for people, as you said, but engage with people.
Can I just add one quick thing to that?
Well,
and if there, this is quick, I promise. If there is not a seat at the table for the people that you and I care about, then they should create their own table.
Amen. I'm moderating. I'm sorry. Jennifer.
See, now I have to answer that.
Well,
that's not fair.
Jennifer, what should philanthropy do?
I think I've spoken a lot to that already. So I would just say, I think from our perspective, we think the focus on statewide policy is critical because we're talking about systems-wide change. We're talking about 5.5 million Texas public school kids, 5.15. I think we do, to Robert's point, I think we do need to be part of the conversation about redefining what education reform is. I think that we need to be the voice for the low-income families and students that we say we are in support of, and I think that we have a very unique perspective, and because we often come from these communities, particularly some of these community foundations we work with, we have a really interesting perspective on some of these larger statewide issues. And I think we need to continue to make connections between policymakers and the communities that we work in, because there's such a huge disconnect between what lawmakers are doing and saying and the decisions they're making at the state versus what's happening in our communities. And I think we're part of the unusual messengers that can help with that message.
Lori, how quick is your response? Is it like 20 seconds?
Yeah, if you create your own,
I know you can hold it.
She said,
Go ahead, before we transition to Lisa.
I have a problem with creating your own table because, again, is that sustainable? When philanthropy leads, and we will that table continue to be there if it is not a part of a public system? That's my answer.
Thank you. Robert, Brandon, Deborah, Lori, Jennifer, you all have been wonderful. Well, it's not over. Now Lisa from NCRP is going to respond, and then in 10 minutes it will be over. I know. Why? You don't want to go yet?
All good things have to come to an end. All right.
So we will transition to NCRP's response. Thank you. Lisa, what you doing? You're not coming over here? You gonna stay over there, girl?
I'm gonna stay over here.
I thought we were gonna converse. Oh, that's okay. All right, so
during the reception we can converse.
Okay, all right. So we heard a lot. See, I had a whole intro and everything.
Oh, go for it.
No. So in terms of our response, we heard a lot. We heard. I mean, this is not an easy conversation to have, and yet we managed not to pull hair or teeth or any of those kinds of things. Yeah. So would you summarize for us, from NCRP's perspective, what you heard, and from there, kind of what is our marching orders? Where do we go? What do we do next?
Well, a 19th century French philosopher named Joseph Joubert once said, "It is better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it." So I really want to applaud our debaters and our panelists for being willing to publicly debate and discuss some really complex questions that are not easily settled. And yet they have tremendous implications for communities across the country. I also want to thank Jocelyn O'Rourke and Ben Barge, who spent a lot of time trying to find you brave souls. It was not easy to find folks willing to come up on stage and do this, and I think that says something about philanthropy and about the willingness of folks to really engage in public discussion and debate. And as Sherece said at the beginning of of this session, that's one of the central goals of Philamplify, is to really foster discussion and debate and to get people in a room together to really hash out these difficult questions. We really want to better understand what foundations are trying to do and what impact their actions have. And those might not always be the same thing, intent versus outcome. The other central goal of Philamplify is to give foundations feedback on the extent to which they practice what NCRP calls strategic social justice philanthropy. And what we mean by that is philanthropy that not only engages affected communities, which I think all of you have said is a really central value to what you're trying to do, but creates equitable solutions with the very people that you seek to benefit. And that brings us back to the question that we've been asking all the way through, which is, can market-oriented reform strategies advance equity and empowerment? So I want to bring us back to what originally caused us to want to do this session, which was that we did assess several foundations for Philamplify that are all trying to tackle this question in one way or another. The William Penn Foundation was one of the first foundations we looked at in Philadelphia, the Daniels Fund in Denver, and most recently the Walton Family Foundation. And our principal researcher for the Walton Family Foundation report, Geeta Gulati-Parti, who really should be doing these remarks in my stead, when she was writing the assessment, she came to us and she said, does NCRP believe that it is possible for a market-based approach to lead to social justice impact? And our response was, yes, it's possible. There is room for diverse strategies and approaches across the ideological and political spectrum to advance meaningful change. And I think, again, we saw from all of our speakers that there's a real passion and commitment to do that. And interestingly, with the Walton Family Foundation assessment in their environmental work, they apply a market-based strategy in a way that is both inclusive of the stakeholders that they're seeking to benefit and effective at achieving their desired outcomes, which are related to water conservation. But in their education reform strategies, what Geeta found was their over-reliance on specific market solutions hindered the transformative potential of the Foundation's education program. Now, I know some of our speakers today will disagree with those findings. And what I think is important to emphasize is that part of the challenge of working in systems is that they are so complex. And in an effort to help some students, it's possible to disadvantage others. And I know I'm opening up probably another can of worms for more debate around that. But in the case of Walton, they were able to embrace the complexity of systems in a very adaptive way in their environmental work, in a very inclusive way. And they could fit that approach to the specific needs and opportunities in each locality. Whereas in their educational work, they were more single-minded, and they did engage stakeholders, but kind of not in the way that I think NCRP would define empowerment, which is really looking at all the different folks who are most affected and engaging them, the students, the families, the teachers, to achieve far-reaching, sustainable, and equitable improvements. I personally like Angela Glover-Blackwell's definition of equity, which is fair and just inclusion. I think it's a deceptively simple definition, and I think the word inclusion is significant, and I think all of you have spoken to the importance of inclusion, but I think it means different things for different people. With only 4 or 5% of public school students currently in charter schools, what does the concept of inclusion mean going forward? So I think that's a charge for all of us to figure out. So Geeta Gulati-Parti urged the Walton Family Foundation to consider its impact on whole school systems. She recommended that Walton prioritize the equity, the quality, and the accountability, all three across K-12 schools, and invest not just in charters, but in traditional school districts, which I know they are doing in some places, right, like in Arkansas. Because those are where the greatest number of students and the most underserved students need to be served. I think that important questions were raised about what happens when a public good like education is being treated as a commodity and is subject to competition? And can it ensure fair and just inclusion for all marginalized school children when that's the case? I think that's still a question to be answered. In the end, it's not about whether any individual school is a charter school or a traditional school, but it's about creating a whole system that supports all students, especially the most marginalized, to thrive, and that includes all of those key stakeholders, youth, parents, teachers, administrators, and crafting solutions. So to quote another sage philosopher, Yogi Berra, if you see a fork in the road, take it. I think philanthropy is at a fork in the road around these questions when it comes to solving pressing community challenges, not just related to education, but also the environment, the urgent issues that are being raised by the Movement for Black Lives. So I think, you know, in sum, NCRP urges foundations to take the path of equity and empowerment in the ways that I've defined it this afternoon, the path of strategic social justice philanthropy, and really work with those it seeks to benefit to forge lasting system-wide solutions. So I think that all of the panelists and debaters spoke to different pieces of that, and I'm hoping that going forward, there's going to be more opportunities for dialogue about how to make that happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sherece. Thank you.
Thank you. So what do we do from here? Well, what we're asking is that we all join the conversation. And you can join this conversation through hashtag Philamplify debate. I thought I had it memorized. Did I have that right? Philanthropy debate, thank you. Hashtag Philamplify debate, and through Twitter. And make your voices heard through participating, going to our website, providing your comments, and just keeping this conversation going. But in keeping this conversation going, you also influence the conversation, direct the conversation. So that is our what we want you all to do and encourage you to do. I want to thank you guys. Have been fabulous. I mean, this has been like you. I didn't want it to end, but I know we can't go on all afternoon. So again, I want to thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Lori. Lisa, thank you. Those were great closing remarks. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us today, for your time, for your brilliance, and for sharing your perspective, because I think it's an important conversation to have, and you guys just literally set it off excellently. We have a reception downstairs for all attendees, and we so much would like you to come and join us downstairs. And with that, I will say thank you, and have a great afternoon.